Hi, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. Welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. In the meantime, if you would like to share where you are joining us from in the chat box, we can kind of see where we're all at this morning or this afternoon or this evening.
Welcome, Bosnia. That's great.
All right. So we will get started here. All right. So thank you so much for joining us for this first webinar in our fall series. The series theme is Trauma and Healing, Teaching and Learning in Today's Climate. My name is Kim Klett, and I am the Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. The Educators Institute for Human Rights, or EIHR, cultivates partnerships among educators globally to create materials and deliver training based on best practices on Holocaust and human rights education. Together, we deliver content and strategies for teaching conflict history and prevention and sustainable peace. Learn more about us at eihr.org. After we end the program and the recording today, feel free to stay on if you have further questions for our esteemed panel. We would love to continue an informal discussion for those of you who would like to stay on for maybe another 10 or 15 minutes. We are so happy to have so many of you with us today. I see a lot of friends from Bosnia, where we've done a lot of work with our partners there. We know you're going to enjoy today's session, Trauma-Informed and Resilience-Oriented Teaching, Teachers Taking Care of Themselves. We hope you can join us in November and December for the next webinars in the series, and we'll put the links in the chat box for those. On November 20th, we'll be doing the next webinar called Native American Boarding Schools and Generational Trauma with board member Dr. Samuel Torres and boarding school survivor Dr. Ramona Klein. And December 11th, our staff librarian Matthew Good will be interviewing author Amy Sarig King on her young adult novel, which I happen to have here, called Attack of the Black Rectangles, which deals with censorship of a Holocaust book. And again, we'll put that registration information in the chat box. I would like to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. EIHR respectfully acknowledges the Piscataway and Nakachank or Anacostan people and the elders both past and present throughout the generations who have stewarded the land where EIHR gathers. We are presenting this acknowledgement in remembrance of the true Indigenous history of this land, in feeling the presence and diversity of Indigenous people today, and in stating our solidarity with Indigenous activists in reconstructing our vocabulary, honoring Indigenous cultures, and advocating for lasting reparations for Indigenous people. Learn more about the land you live on at native-land.ca. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, EIHR Board President John Heffernan. John is the president of the Foundation for Systemic Change. He has over 30 years of experience in development, human rights, rule of law, democracy and governance, humanitarian relief, and post-conflict reconstruction projects in the United States, Africa, South America, Asia, and Europe. He has served as executive director of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Speak Truth to Power, director of the Genocide Prevention Initiative at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where he established the Genocide Prevention Task Force, Senior Investigator with Physicians for Human Rights, Chief of Party for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Guyana, South America, Founder and Executive Director of the Coalition for International Justice, and Country Representative for the former Yugoslavia and Sudan for the International Rescue Committee. He was trained as a community organizer by Fred Ross. He serves as a board chair for Disability Rights International and is on the board of Social Documentary Network. John, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, Kim, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us on this Sunday. It really is my pleasure to be able to participate in the first of several webinars focusing on trauma in the classroom, if you will. I think this is timely and so relevant. I would really like this to be a conversation, so I encourage all of you to post your questions in the chat, and as Kim said, that we will have an opportunity at the end to have an informal conversation about what we've been discussing for the last hour. It is my distinct pleasure to host this, and in doing so, introducing our panelists, starting with Brita Bostad Kinsley, who is a teacher in North Dakota, where she teaches 8th graders in language arts. Brita has worked with the New Americans as a high school English teacher. Her work with English learners, the majority of her students possessing refugee status, drove her to pursue and provide training in both trauma-sensitive and culturally responsive teaching. Her continued learning led her in 2017 to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where I used to work, where she was a teacher fellow there. She has a master's in curriculum and instruction. She's on the National Board Certification in Language Arts and Training in Equity Facilitation through the Equity Literacy Institute. Welcome, Brita, and we look forward to hearing from you. And next we have Dr. Al Fuertes, who's a fellow board member of mine at Educators Institute for Human Rights. Al has had a long and storied, if I must say, career. He is a field practitioner and consultant who specializes in community-based trauma healings as an integral component of peace building and conflict transformation. Al has traveled extensively around the world, particularly in places affected by war, armed conflict, natural disaster like Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia. Al works with government, religious, military, and community leaders, as well as NGO development workers, school administrators, teachers, youth, refugees, and internally placed persons. He's the faculty director of the Global Education Program in the Philippines. And when I asked him, I said, what university is this associated with? He said, the entire Philippines. Concerning human trafficking and community engagement. Al is an associate professor at George Mason University. He teaches courses in human trafficking, smuggling, forgiveness, reconciliation, psychosocial trauma healing, refugee and internal displacement. He is also a senior scholar of the advancement of well-being. Welcome, Al. Let's get started, and I've asked Brita to tell us a little bit about, give us some context in terms of what she's dealing with right now as a teacher in North Dakota vis-a-vis the incredibly complex political environment that we're all experiencing in the education world here in the United States. So Brita, take it away.
Yeah, so like he said, I am currently teaching, and that's something I'm very aware of, even as I participate in this panel. I live in a predominantly rural area, so lots of farming, very conservative values in general, when you look at the country's demographics in the US. And so as education has become more politicized, I've seen it get down even into middle schools where you have students who aren't even able to vote for a few years now, very loudly sharing political beliefs on different issues that may not even feel necessarily relevant to our area of the country. And you see a lot of people wearing different clothing or apparel to represent their beliefs, and how the polarization of what we're seeing here is that sometimes these beliefs that they're putting out there, learners aren't even aware of the impact that they can have on others in the school community. And as an educator, I have to ensure that it is a safe space for all of the learners who are present. And I'm also a human being in that space who's also having an interaction with some of those ideas as well. So it's figuring out, how do I ensure that this is a safe space for everyone, including myself, without ever making the mistake of putting forth my political opinions, which is not allowed within the district. And so it's this really tough struggle where every step of my planning process, I have to look at it and relook at it and look at it again to see, is there a spot where someone's going to have an issue, and do I have a plan for that? Is this something I can stand by? Is this something I'm going to be supported in doing? Do I have alternative options for learners? You know, am I putting my neck out for something? And is this a safe choice for me?
Thank you, Brita. I just, from that brief introduction, I have so many questions, but I will save them. And at this point, would love to hear from Al and you know, and what you're doing in the world of trauma, which you've been doing for a long time, but how, you know, what relevance does your work have to what's happening right now in this country vis-a-vis the you know, divided political climate in our education space. Al.
Hey, thank you, John. Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you are joining this panel from. So welcome. I'm just deeply honored and privileged to be part of the panel presentation. And I thank the Educators Institute for Human Rights for organizing this event. As John mentioned earlier, my specialization is in psychosocial trauma healing. My background is in conflict resolution and transformation. And for those of us who are participating in this event right now, who come and have experienced conflict, you know, whether it's personal, interpersonal, communal, or national, or maybe regional/global level, we know that conflict usually has far-reaching consequences, particularly when conflict becomes violent. No, I always remind myself and the people that I work with that conflict is inevitable. However, violent conflict is a choice. Violence is a choice. And I always believe that violence leaves people with lifelong problems, whether we're talking about interpersonal level or communal level or national level. And this is basically what prompted me to bring and focus my work and my career, my being a practitioner and my being a teacher in the field of psychosocial trauma healing, you know, because trauma, as we know, transcends academic, professional boundaries, class, religious boundaries. And it is very difficult to continue living and doing our work and try to, you know, resolve and address conflict if the traumas of our communities and people are left unaddressed. So this is just in a nutshell, you know, but part of this whole personal introduction at this point is that my being in the field of trauma healing started as a personal quest for my own healing and wholeness. And then I realized in the process of my own healing journey that I also wanted to be a healer for others. And that is to be able to be there for others who are also searching for wholeness, for integration amidst, you know, whatever forms of human atrocities and conflict they may be going through. So it's just a, you know, a part of what I do and what brought me to where I am today. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Al. Britta, my question for you, just starting off, is you talk about what you're experiencing right now in the classroom, and I'd like to know a little bit more about this kind of evolution, how things have changed, let's say, even in the last few years, and I'm assuming that you're, well, you've had training, probably more than many. It's not necessarily made you have the capacity to deal with some of the trauma that you're experiencing today, particularly related to this larger climate. So I'd love to know a little bit about, one, how that's kind of evolved, and how that's changed your life as an educator, and two, just how you're dealing with it.
Yeah, so I resonated with what Al said, this idea of starting from my own personal journey of healing as well. I think that my journey as an individual aligns really closely with my growth as an educator. And I think as educators, sometimes we think that educator is our identity, teacher is our identity, but it's just an aspect of it. So I would start with, I jumped into education, just wide-eyed and bush-tailed, and was like, oh, so optimistic. And I worked with a demographic who had a lot of traumas. And I knew that I was working through my own pieces, but I wasn't as aware of them as I became once I started working closely with individuals who are facing a lot of racism to begin with, or a lot, right? Because I had a lot of, students of color, students who are new to the country, so new Americans who were facing these challenges, and I was seeing them up close and personal, and I felt their pain so clearly, so deeply, that, compassion fatigue was definitely real. And I didn't recognize it at the time. I had never gotten training on burnout in educators. And it was really when I had a student incident that triggered a past trauma that I was aware of, but I wasn't aware the degree to which it was influencing my everyday life. That I became aware I was starting to have flashbacks. I was starting to have these experiences, and I didn't quite know what was happening to me. And I connected with a therapist and was diagnosed with PTSD. And I remember just being so shocked because to me, I just never thought that was a thing I would have. And it just, I had always associated that in the US. We hear it with veterans, and I'm not a veteran. And so for me, coming to terms with how my own trauma was showing up in my classroom, and how the trauma of my students was then showing up with me, really made me aware, like, I needed to do some personal work. Near the end of that burnout, where I started to really have to reassess education, was a very politicized presidential campaign. And as a teacher with new Americans, my students were really terrified. They were really terrified that the person who was running was going to stop their families from continuing to come over, that they would get kicked out of the country. And when you sit in a classroom with such palpable fear, and it's with people you care for, you feel that. You start to take on, again, that compassion fatigue. You feel their fear, their pain, and it keeps you from being able to support them necessarily, because you become almost as paralyzed by it. And so I started feeling that hypervigilance of wondering, are these people in this building, are they here for my kids? Are they here for someone else? Does this person care about me, or do they care about something else? And I had never experienced that before, that political election, where it felt so divisive, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. I still see that politics have gotten more ingrained, and I would say not in a good way, in our schools. I think human rights are political. I think there are really great political things we can talk about, like the future of our planet and how do we strive for justice. When I think it becomes problematic is when people attach themselves to one specific person above everything else and aren't able to have deep conversations. And so I've seen a lot more name calling. I've seen a lot more targeted attacks towards students in the LGBT communities. We've seen a rise the last 2 years in anti-Semitism. in our community, just within the schools, that I had never seen before. So I had never heard growing up any comments that were anti-Semitic. In the last 2 years, we've had specific comments where we've had to do restorative circles to try and figure out what was going on and to fix some of the harm that has happened. So I see those two paths. It's kind of a complicated answer, but I totally see this idea of me dealing with some of the more, as education became more complicated, it was more and more difficult for me to not address my own needs personally, because I think if I had not had extra support outside of school, family, friends, and therapy, I don't think I would have been in education anymore, because it has become really, really stressful and really tricky to balance as everything becomes very, it feels like any moment could be the moment where you get in trouble for doing something, right? And there's a lot less grace to make mistakes or to not show up perfectly.
Thank you, Brita. Al.
Yes. Well, first, I just would like to remind all our participants that this panel, this event, is really also very much a way to validate and affirm what many of us teachers, educators are going through. You know, we seldom have this kind of public space by which we could just also bring out into the open how teachers, how you and me are being stressed out, you know. And so this is our moment to also just affirm and validate ourselves of what we have been through, the challenges, the limitations, the pains, you know, the difficulties that we experience as teachers, as educators, and at the same time, how we manage to overcome them, or how we manage to sustain ourselves in the midst of this. And for all of the participants, and myself included at this very moment, you know, I have this personal question. How many of us here have never experienced stress? Okay, if you're a teacher, an educator, or even a student, or any, you know, someone who is doing any type of profession, let us know if you have never experienced stress in your life. Okay, feel free to type in our chat room, because I think everybody has experienced stress, right? However, and this is my point, persistent and prolonged stress lasting more than 30 days, and this is according to clinical and medical studies, our stress might have become or turned into trauma. This is a very kind of clear-cut definition between, or distinction between, stress and trauma that I would like to incorporate or integrate, and for us to be mindful about this in this panel presentation. And so think of an experience or two, you know, where you were stressing out. And how do you know that you're stressing out? You know, what are the manifestations? How does your stress manifest? In other words, from school, in teaching, in educating people, the communities that you're a part of. How is your stress manifesting out? Because again, stress lasting more than 30 days, our stress might have turned into a trauma. And we know that one of the major perspectives of trauma, and I constantly remind myself about this as a teacher, is that trauma, one major perspective is trauma refers to any event or events that leave us with lifelong problems. And I would like to assume that teachers are not exempted when it comes to this. And so how are we experiencing this type of experience, basically? And Brita mentioned about burnout. Stress plus burnout equals compassion fatigue. As teachers, as educators, have we experienced really just, you know, being tired from teaching, being exhausted, not just physically exhaustion, but mental, psychological, even emotional exhaustion? And I would like to integrate here part of my experience, teachers, for example, having this extreme idealism, teachers who aspire for teaching excellence, education excellence, and yet they feel like they have low autonomy in school. Teachers not having much space to move around and navigate the teaching learning environment. Teachers who feel like they don't have full governance in their teaching, in the materials that they teach. Teachers who lack resources. How many teachers, how many of you here, how many of us here use our own personal resources, our pocket money, to avail of those resources for our students, for our school? Teachers feeling overworked. And this is part of my experience. That's why it's very important that I'm also taking self-care measures. And then teachers experiencing lack of appropriate compensation. Let's just say it this way. This is part of relative deprivation. We feel like we've worked so hard, and yet the benefits, the compensation that we receive in return do not seem to compensate the amount of work, effort, time, and just our sense of investment into it. And then, not to mention poor workplace relationship, family, financial pressures, conflict within the family, feeling economically insecure, and what have you. Here in the United States, teachers are really feeling the brunt of what I would call, this educational system assault. Our educational system in the United States is being assaulted from various levels. Now we have books that are banned, and this has been made legal in some states. And so we have certain courses that are now in the process of being banned from our curriculum, even though we felt the importance of these courses, these subject matters. So how are teachers being impacted by this? That's why I would like to bring in into our conversation here, knowing the manifestations or indicators of our stress. How are we stressing out given all the problems and challenges and limitations, that we experience and face in our profession, in our life? And how are we coping with it? One of the ways by which I cope with my stress and trauma as a whole is really to go back to my sense of calling. I always believe that teaching is a vocation, because otherwise, if my understanding of teaching is that it is a source of income, perhaps I have already quit a long time ago. In other words, I have to continue holding on to something beyond material, beyond physical. That this is my passion, that this is my calling, that teaching is my way of giving back to the universe what the universe has extended to me growing up when I was a student. Teaching to me is my expression of deep gratitude for all my elementary, high school, college, graduate school teachers and mentors and what have you. And I would like to highlight at this point, and thank you, Kim, for the handout. These are being compiled by my colleagues at the Center for Justice and Peace at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, based on personal narratives as well of people experiencing prolonged stress, including trauma. And I think this basically also applies to each one of us here. Teachers, educators, every participant who is here. I would like you to please pay close attention to this first handout. These are some of the indicators or manifestations of stress, prolonged, persistent stress vis-a-vis trauma. If you notice, the impact, the effects are interdisciplinary. If you have a chance, when you have time, I would like you to go over each of these and perhaps encircle those manifestations that may apply to your story, to your experience, to your profession. So we have the emotional impact of stress or trauma. We have the cognitive, the thinking aspect. We have the behavioral aspect. For example, when we feel burnout, how does that manifest? When the passion that we used to have before is now gone, resulting to what we call compassion fatigue. How does our compassion fatigue manifest in terms of the quality of our teaching, in terms of how we relate to our students, in terms of how we communicate with our colleagues, in terms of how we live out our lives with our loved ones, families, and children, and what have you. And then there's also that physical component to it, and then the spiritual aspect of it, and then of course the societal effects, because we as human beings, whether we are aware of it or not, are by nature social. So how does your stress manifest? I think teachers, I think this is part of our self-care. You know, if the community where we live in is not able to fully extend to us what we need to sustain our well-being, I think we have to really help ourselves in this context. So maybe just a minute of going over these handout. And then on this other, the second handout is what we can do to take care of ourselves. In other words, these are actually two sides of the same coin. The previous handout highlights the impacts, the indicators or manifestations of our stress or trauma, which is very important for us to be aware of. And then the second handout highlights what we can do to take care of ourselves. So there are also ways by which to address the emotional manifestation of stress, the cognitive, the behavioral, the physical, the spiritual, and also societal. When you have a chance, again, I would also like or invite you to encircle those self-care measures or mechanisms that you are already doing, that you have been doing, and also perhaps put a check mark on those items that you still plan to do, that you realize, actually I can do it. You know, it will not cost me any cent to be able to do this. It's just a matter of being mindful about this and how to integrate this into my daily routine. And perhaps another component for us to make this happen is really to establish our own support system within our community, within our school, you know, because I would like to believe that stress and trauma among educators and teachers is not an isolated case. I would like to believe that others may also be going through a similar experience. And so if we can connect with one another and then perhaps start to create, you know, that kind of a small community of teachers and educators. In fact, I would like to believe some of you may have been doing this already. Perhaps you have already, your school perhaps may have already initiated this, you know, as a way to sustain ourselves, because human strength depletes. Okay, do you know? I wonder how many of us know that already. Human strength deplete. Time will come, and that's part of what we call burnout or compassion fatigue. And remember, we cannot give what we don't have. That's why we need to replenish our strength. We need to get reinvigorated, to get re-energized. And sometimes we have to extend it to ourselves and to one another. So I would like to stop my sharing at this point, and we will basically continue the conversations, you know, in the process.
Great.
I'd love.
Yeah, go ahead, Brita.
Yeah, I'd love to build on what Al said. I, like many teachers during COVID, and I think I'm still processing COVID, we've been without masks for a while, which was, I mean, North Dakota was very quick to be like, everyone's back in. which was also a piece of stress. And I, as an English language arts teacher, I turn to books and literature as like my life raft. If I feel like I'm not sure what's going on, I seek out that information. So when I heard Al talking about this idea of look at these strategies, a couple of things that worked for my type A, really organized brain. There's a book called Burnout by two sisters and researchers, the Nagoski siblings, and they talk through it, specifically the burnout process and what it looks like. And what I loved is at the end of the book, they gave a formula essentially to look at how are you spending your day and categorizing it into categories. So you code it by social, so time for connections, time for rest, time for making meaning, and time for completing the stress cycle, whatever that looks like for you. And so completing the stress cycle could be working out. It could be, like I see in the chat box, writing. It could be some of those pieces on Al's document as well. But it really helped me see some imbalances. And it also helped me see where there was maybe a disconnect, where I have found education to be a source of meaning. And as things became more and more politicized, I found myself becoming really disheartened and feeling like I was losing that meaning, feeling like it was being watered down and taken away, and that I wasn't able to bring critical issues to students, and I wasn't able to honor their ability to think about complex issues. And I felt like that was where I was starting to see a disconnect. And I think educators can look at those pieces and say, do I need to change who I'm working with, who I'm serving, who I'm, is it a grade? Is it a district? But the other piece I found really helpful was through, on one of Al's lists, it had a type of trauma therapy. I went to a different trauma therapy, but one of the processes they talk you through is to identify the story you're telling yourself and to identify evidence for and evidence against it. So there can be times where I saw in the chat, like it feels like students or learners forget that we're human beings. And if it's enough students on the right day or on the wrong day, it can really feel so demoralizing. And you can just, I had this feeling on Friday. I just felt like I was taking hits and kids were having a rough day. And I was really struggling because I was running out of the energy to hold my boundary here between my teacher self and my human self of like, hey, I need you to stop yelling. I need you to stop, responding this way. And in those moments, it can feel like, students, you can hear yourself in your head be like, students don't see me as a human. They don't see my humanity. But when you look at evidence for and against it, even your toughest kid, if you really sit there, you're like, do I really think this kid doesn't see me as a human? Or do I know that there are reasons why this student behaved this way? So sometimes it's giving yourself a chance to unpack the thing that you're feeling, but to challenge it a little bit, to say, I am still feeling this and I didn't like how it made me feel. But from stopping that story, because that story sometimes can lead us. And I see a lot of people in the chat box talking about writing. That was how, like, mine was a writing-based therapy. So it was write it down. What is the thing that went on in your head in that moment? How did you feel? And what is the actual evidence you have to support that as truth? Versus, is there a way you can challenge that? So that was really helpful for me. So as I heard Al talk, I think anytime we can share both the fact that we feel that way, like we've probably all been there, standing there just feeling like, I don't know if I can show up as your teacher today, you're hurting my feelings, or I'm having a hard day, but also share the things that helped us reckon with those hard days, I think is really powerful in education, especially.
I have a question. What you're both talking about, I think, is really, really helpful in terms of your own personal way of dealing with it, diagnosing the problem and then coming up with coping mechanisms. And there's great information in there on the chat as well. But how important is it for you to get the support of your school and or district? And assuming that it is, what can be done to change that system if it's not supporting what's happening to you vis-a-vis the trauma that you're experiencing?
Yeah, John, first, I would like to, in my case, I have to be able to differentiate whether my stressors, are personal or interpersonal in nature, or they are systemic or structural. If you notice, some of what I have mentioned could be systemic. There is what we call systemic violence or structural violence. It's just that it is part of the system. Teachers not getting all the privileges or benefits, that they so deserve. Schools that are not being fully funded or, equipped with resources just to really, for everybody to enjoy learning, and for teachers to enjoy teaching. Some of these could be systemic in nature. So my way of dealing with that is, again, first I have to be mindful about this. And then the second one is really on the personal and interpersonal level, reach out to my friends and colleagues. If nobody else is providing teachers and educators this space by which they can come together and then just try to make sense. Teachers, participants, for example, how many of us here, how many of you, really have that public space by which you could come together and then just kind of, bring your concerns, your pains, your struggles out into the open and still feeling, welcome, still feeling safe. Here in the United States at this point, I think it is very difficult. Sometimes you get, bashed, you get harassed, and so teachers just suffer in silence, basically. But at what cost? At what expense? Because it will start to eat us up inside. It will start to consume us, sooner or later. And so reach out to those who might also be feeling the same. In my case, I even hang out with my students. At least one good thing that I really appreciate, given my work environment, is that I happen to be in a university, George Mason University, which is a public university, in Fairfax, Virginia, that is very supportive of their faculty and staff, including students. In fact, just more than a year ago, the university has initiated this, what they call George Mason University Chooses Kindness. That is a university-wide initiative against the backdrop of so much division and polarization. So at least, and then they have identified teachers, staff who could be like kindness ambassadors. And Mason is very supportive in terms of our research, in terms of our teaching and what have you. It has lots of limitations, but on a personal level, I could feel, and I knew that, Mason is doing the best, to at least support their teacher, the faculty, staff, including students. And so I have this privilege. And so I take this privilege, John and Brita and the rest of us participants, as it comes with an accountability and responsibility, because I know for a fact that many of my colleagues who are in the teaching and education profession may have a totally different experience, and so reach out and then do my own self-care. Very much conscious of many of what's been suggested in that second handout, what we can do to help ourselves. And then continue maintaining my advocacy. I still have that sense of activism, because to me, that is my way of asserting my aspirations, my sense of idealism, but at the same time, maintaining the personal self-care component of it. Right. Yes.
Thanks. What about you, Brita? What kind of support are you getting among your colleagues?
It has shifted since the start of education. The first building I worked in, I would say I tried to make systemic changes, but what I learned from my maybe failed attempts was that, if the issues are systemic, then your solutions need to be systemic. And an individual is not a system, they're an individual. And so it is so essential that you find people who are your people who will support you. And if you're going to be the one who will say the hard thing, then you need to trust that the other people are going to second it and third it and jump in and throw their weight behind you or with you. And that's really what I learned in that first career. I am really lucky in that my superintendent is really wonderful. I also see that she has to walk the line to ensure that she's representing the entire community. And if certain groups of the community are more outspoken than others, that's where you see an imbalance in how policies might be representing certain views more than others. And I've noticed there are a lot of parents who love what educators do, but they're not maybe showing up at school boards arguing that to that extent, right? That you're going to see people who are showing up with issues, who don't like what's happening. And so you have this like really loud minority, and it's getting bigger, but it is still, from what I've seen when we've given surveys, it's still the minority, but they're showing up more consistently. They're showing up more systemically. And that's what moves the needle. So my big piece would be don't do it alone. If you choose, take time to think about what is the change that you want to make, right? Follow the thing, the thing that makes you sick to your gut that you want to address. Figure out if you have the capacity to address it. And if you don't think you do, find others who can, get in that boat with you and do it, because you don't want it to burn you out. You can't make the changes if you're no longer there to advocate. And so for me, it was an important lesson in humility, and also an understanding like the gravity of the issues, and that like you can't, even though you may believe it in your heart to be what's clearly right, or you're like, this doesn't make any sense. If it's part of the system, enough people have thought it made sense that you're going to need a systemic approach. You need to have people in your community who are going to stand with you, so you're not the only one standing there, and so that you can push forward with that change. And you just have to be persistent. It is knowing that, it is going to be a trudge at times. I've seen some things happen quickly, and then I've also just seen like you just have to continue pushing for it. I think when I think of like John Lewis, he's one of my like heroes, and I just think of how he maintains such optimism through all of his, good trouble and struggles for justice. And so it's also that question of like, how do I protect myself to ensure that I'm not losing the joy and the hope that I'm fighting for, right? Because joy is at the center of it. It should always be joy. I'm fighting for joy. If I'm fighting for joy, I need to fight with joy somehow, and I can't lose that. I have to protect it.
Yep.
And John, I just wanted to bring up, there's a question in the Q&A that actually addresses this. Alice is asking, many public school districts are themselves under attack, and the instinct of administrators and school boards can be self-protective. How can we encourage the kind voices, those who want to bring healing to the community?
I think the way you encourage them will depend on your role and what you're allowed to do within your district. So my role as an educator, there are limits on what I'm allowed to advocate for in the community, at least in North Dakota. There are restrictions on what counts as protesting, what counts as my personal speech versus professional speech. So really figuring out how you can make those connections in your community, and how can you go about pushing people to show up. Sometimes it can just be as simple as telling parents at a parent-teacher conference, it's been a really hard year. If you support what we do, we'd love to hear from you. That's a really easy invitation. Or when a parent sends you something positive saying, gosh, that meant so much to me. Would you be willing to share that here so that people know we are doing good things? I want this to be heard. I want your voice to be heard, right? So it's just giving an extra push so that they know, because if a parent isn't in education, they might not know the climate that educators are working within. What do you think, Al?
Yeah, I was wondering if, in addition to what Brita has said, and I'm sure there are other ways and mechanisms to address the question and make this happen, maximize the creation of what I would call healing circles among teachers, among educators, I mentioned this earlier, and that is just a public space by which teachers and are invited to be part of it. Just a conversation in terms of how they are doing, as simple as that, what their struggles are, without necessarily, in fact, finding direct solutions to these problems, but just a space. I think that is enough for many of us teachers and educators, to sustain ourselves, from what we are going through. Know that we have a space, know that we are not alone, know that there are people who are also going through the same or similar experiences. And so how can we support each other? How can we be there for each other? A public space. And then perhaps create initiatives as well that would bring teachers and parents, to the same healing circles outside of always this political, the politicization of it, but rather just have a heart-to-heart conversation, in terms of how everybody is doing, how parents are also experiencing, and perhaps in the process, there might come out to be something tangible, something organic out of this. I think one of the most effective and ways to sustain ourselves is really to have a space by which we can express our felt realities, and feeling we are not alone and that we are being supported by others. At the same time, we are also able to extend support to others.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left. I continue to encourage you all to put your questions in the chat box, and then as we noted before, once we're done with the sort of the formal webinar, we'll have an informal discussion as well. One of the things that I got from this discussion, Brita, and this came from you, and this is, applies to everything in life in terms of being thoughtful about your advocacy and how strategically you can affect change, but that the value of collective advocacy, of bringing along your fellow colleagues, is so important, for a variety of reasons that relate to trauma writ large, in terms of your own sensibility and how helpful it is to bring like-minded people along with you in support of what you're trying to change.
Yeah, I think a great resource that it made me think of too, it's a book by Karen Walrond. It's called The Lightmaker's Manifesto, and it is a guide rooted in activism. It's not specifically for teaching, but it is how to work for change without losing your joy. And so that idea of like, what are we working for? What are we fighting for? Because if we achieve it, but we're all miserable by then, because we couldn't make it there without losing some of that, right? What's the point? And like Al brought up, having a shared space for teachers to get together and share these pieces where you can just show up really messy and say like, gosh, this was terrible. This is not good. And have someone validate it, and then have someone there to be like, what do you need? What do you need as a caretaker, right? What do you need? I have it in my group chat of educators from different buildings. So they know I had a bad day, and then what do you need? And they're going to show up with something somehow, either words, or they're going to drop something off, or they're going to show up in a way that makes you say like, okay, I'm not alone in this. This is a bad day. It's not indicative of my entire career. It is not indicative of who I am. It is just a bad day. And they're having a good day, which means I will have those good days, and they're going to walk alongside me to get me there. Right. So.
Yeah.
Al?
Yeah. I just would like to continue reminding, ourselves to always, maintaining our joy could also be done by making sure we continue doing what we love the most, outside of the teaching kind of profession, our hobbies. Sometimes, again, we become, the work could be extremely too much that we forget, our passions, our other passions. I think that's very important. How many of us, teachers, have set aside the things that we are also passionate about because we are being, this overload in terms of course and work and all the pressures from school, from the community that we live in, So I think it's very important for us to really kind of have this spatial, SPATIAL, kind of competency as well, and to nurture that within ourselves, to see the different dimensions by which to maintain our sense of wholeness, our sense of well-being. And it is a byproduct of many different dimensions, being in a community, being in a supportive group could be one, making sure that we give ourselves some personal time. That's very important. But at the same time, also finding ways by which to channel our sense of, our activism, our advocacy, to also help to address any type of systemic or structural limitations that are also impacting our sense of well-being as teachers in general. It's easy said than done, I know. That's why one of the questions I would like to leave us with at this point is, okay, so teachers, you have these initiative, now you have this newfound realization or passion. What is stopping you from doing it? What is stopping us from finding ways to sustain ourselves?
Yeah. Well, you're both leaving us on a positive note, which is great, because so much of what we're getting today is just this bombardment of evidence that educators are continually being restricted to speak. I mean, it's a basic fundamental violation of our human rights writ large, if you really look at it in terms of freedom of expression and so on and so forth. So I think what you've provided us with is some really concrete tools. Is one, first, how to deal with our own situation and our own trauma that will allow us then to be more productive educators writ large, because if we don't first focus on ourselves, then what value will we be to our students? Yeah. So I appreciate that very much. Before I conclude, I just want to make sure that if either of you have anything else that you want to say at this point. I know this is a conversation that could go on and on and on, but I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I deeply appreciate that. But either Brita or Al, please, one last word.
Yeah. For every one of us, I also would like us to, honor ourselves for the things that help us to sustain ourselves, and sometimes we need to be mindful about this. Name them one by one. What is sustaining you? What's sustaining me? What keeps us going as teachers, as educators, given all the stressors in life, the traumas, the limitations, the struggles and challenges. But the fact that you continue to teach every single day on a day-to-day basis suggests that you still have a lot of strength somewhere within yourself, within our immediate community. Can we name them one by one? What sustains you? What keeps you going as teachers? So I think that would be our re-entry, part of the re-entry undertaking after this panel.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
Brita?
Yeah, and I would just say, acknowledging that showing up here today is part of showing up for yourself, and consider a way you can show up for yourself each day, whether that be, what Al says, like finding those things that gosh, fill you with such warmth, right? Like you can almost just feel how divinely warmth it is, the joy it brings to you, and sitting longer in whatever moment that is, but also just finding ways to show up for yourself. Showing up for yourself can be a boundary of being like, no, I'm leaving at the time I'm allowed to leave at, and I'm not bringing anything with me. And it can also be showing up for yourself by doing something that has no productive value, but you just really want to do it. It just brings you joy. It's not showing up for yourself in order to be more productive later. It's literally just showing up because you get to, because you're a human being who's not a machine. You don't have to have everything geared towards productivity. It's just about joy, and nurturing those pieces first, I think, will naturally lead to happier, more fulfilled lives. And I think that's really just the beauty of living. And if we can live beautiful lives, then we'll find beauty in education and wherever else we go. But we have to find that beauty first with ourselves.
Well, you guys are the best. And this has been enlightening and certainly informative for me, and I hope for everybody on here. And please, join me in thanking both Brita and Al for this great webinar. Yay! And
Thank you.
and please join us for our future webinars, and you'll find out information about that on our website or by contacting one of us. But now, Kim, unless am I doing this right? We're opening up to a kind of an informal conversation, right?
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to stop the recording, and